Welcome back, everyone. Michael here from Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to talk about the collapse of quality of living, at least on a relative basis, of countries like Canada, where I am originally from, and what this might mean for you in terms of immigration, but also in terms of how people see the world very inaccurately. So we're going to look today at some data that somebody sent me from Numbeo, and we're going to look comparing data from 20 years ago to data today, and examine how people's perception of the world has frankly just been wrong. And this factors in a little bit into a conversation I had yesterday with some people. We were talking a bit about the progression of countries and quality. There was a video that somebody had put up on Twitter discussing the Chinese vehicle quality and costs, particularly electric vehicles, compared to that of the US. And they were discussing how Biden is bringing in 100% tariffs on these Chinese manufactured electric vehicles. Ken Griffin, founder of Citadel, recently made a comment about how incoherent this policy is, because they say on the one hand, hey, we want to advance a green, climate-friendly agenda, but yet the people who are actually producing quality, affordable electric vehicles happen to be the Chinese, but hey, let's not allow them to come and bring them in. So there's like kind of this very incongruent perspective. But anyway, that being said, in the conversation I was having yesterday, a little bit of the discussion was around, oh yeah, but they may produce things that are cheap, but do they have quality? And of course, the historic idea has been that, oh my gosh, quality from these parts of the world is bad. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the same was true of Japan until it wasn't. So what I pointed out to them at the time when I was talking yesterday was, I was like, wait a minute, Japanese have produced cars that are far better quality than American cars for decades now. Toyota has dominated quality ratings. They, have had some competition from the Koreans, but that's Koreans, not Americans. Americans have simply not managed to compete even remotely similarly. Anyway, in this video on Twitter, they were just kind of pointing out some of the issues with those companies. For example, GM had received about $7 billion worth of government subsidies, which turned out to be less than the subsidies that BYD received in China. And so they were saying, well, the cars aren't better or cheaper in China because of the fact that they've received less subsidies. The difference is that GM then went and did $7 billion of share buybacks, and BYD put the money into research and improvement and things like this. And as a result, they're going to basically dominate a lot of the global car sales, when GM is frankly kind of unheard of outside of the US, which is pretty sad. So anyway, let's dive in and talk. So going through this list of countries, and of course I deal lots with this because we help people to relocate to other parts of the world. If you're interested in getting residency permits, going somewhere else, being a part of what I call the Great Migration, please reach out to us, book a call, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. But I'm going to go through with you quickly, because the data that we had here, this is the Numbeo, and here's the thing that I would point out about these rankings. These are highly subjective, right? It depends on what it is that you do to decide what is important to you. Even how you measure each of these things is somewhat questionable. So for example, you can go to look at, what are the business-friendly rankings? So I've done business in a lot of different countries. I can tell you I have some strong disagreements with what some people will consider to be more business-friendly versus less business-friendly, but that's another question. The point is that the general idea is true. So in other words, let's go back to the early 90s, okay? So in the early 90s, you could go to some place like Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and not be very impressed, right? You could go to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia today, and I would put it against any Canadian city. Now you can debate whether you prefer KL to Vancouver. That's, personal preference. But the point is that 40 years ago, that wasn't even a debate. Like, nobody could reasonably have that conversation. And this just shows how the order of things is changing in the world. We see this with massively declining GDP on a relative basis in, say, Europe. I'm very, very critical of the EU. And if you kind of look over the last, it's like 10 or 20 years, their relative share of GDP has dropped by like 10%. Which, that's a big share when you're talking about 100%, right? Like, it's a massive, massive change. And they're kind of rapidly moving towards irrelevance. Well, let's talk here about what it was in 2013, according to this particular data set. So at the time, Switzerland was this is quality of life ranking. Switzerland, Germany, United States, Sweden, Canada. Interesting, UAE was number 6 at the time. Denmark, Norway, Qatar, interesting. Austria, Finland, Australia, New Zealand, Netherlands, Japan, Estonia, France, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So the point is, Canada was number 5 at the time, right? Let's fast forward to what the recent rankings are today. So today, Canada is number 33, okay? And, you can argue what this is. I would argue to some respects, quality of life has meaningfully decreased in some place like Canada, and in a bunch of these kind of former Western developed countries, as I would call them, the quality of life is decreasing, mainly because cost of living is rising, in particular the cost of housing, faster than wages. That's just kind of the fact of life for a lot of people. My brothers live in Vancouver. I was talking to my one brother who, works a good professional career, said, whatever it was, 5-10 years ago when he got his current job, he said he didn't hear anybody complaining about cost of living. Now everybody complains about it. Like, just the cost of housing has gotten really out of control for the average person. The average person simply cannot afford to buy a place. And that's, got a meaningful downside. Anyway, let's go through here. So the current number 1, according to the same rankings, Luxembourg, then Netherlands, Iceland, Denmark, Finland, Oman, Switzerland. Anyway, you can kind of go down. And like I said, you get far, far down, and number 33 is Canada. The reason, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because I really encourage people who watch this channel, the most basic thing, when somebody contacts me and they say, hey, Michael, what should I do? I say, start by going and traveling to some other places. See that the world is maybe not the way that you think. I'm here today in Saudi Arabia. I can tell you my experience of Saudi Arabia is radically different than most people would expect. I talk lots to clients in Canada, in the US, in various parts of Europe, etc. One of the frequent things I'll hear about UAE is, oh, my wife doesn't want to go. She's concerned about, Muslim culture, etc. And I tell her, look, by all means, your personal preference is your personal preference. So, one person likes one person likes another place, great, no issues. However, I would encourage you to at least visit and spend some time, because I think what you will find is that your beliefs about how things are in that place are radically different than how they actually are in that place. And so, for example, in Dubai, I notice Islam about as much as I notice Christianity in the southern US. Pretty comparable sort of relationship. You might have preferences one way or another, and that's totally up to you. But at the end of the day, people's views on how these places are, having not been there, tends to be woefully ignorant, woefully off of what actually is taking place. And so it's worth going and checking them out. And then once you check them out, you start to realize that, well, maybe I have a lot more options in the world as to where I can go live, depending again on what my preferences are, than I previously thought. I certainly grew up in Canada being told constantly, Canada's like the best country in the world to live in. And I think that narrative has been repeated long after that is true. It was probably at least marginally true during the time when I was growing up. So through the 80s, 90s, there's probably a reasonable argument you could make that it's like, they were definitely up there. Definitely hard to find a place that was definitively better, right? Nowadays, it's hard to make an argument that they're definitively better. And that shift is really huge. If you read the book Factfulness, highly recommended, he tells the story of like how Malaysia in the 70s, there was like a big gap between the developed countries and the developing countries, and how that gap that existed in the 70s just doesn't exist today. And this is increasingly true as we have global access to technology. So let's just think about something like Starlink for internet. Let's think about things like, Netflix for entertainment. Let's think about global supply chains for being able to get more or less whatever product in a lot of parts of the world, not everywhere, but a lot of parts of the world. Conveniences aren't quite there in some respects. Infrastructure is definitely not there in some respects in a lot of parts of the world. But I mean, I've had people working for me in various parts of Africa, and they can access iPhones and all this other stuff that, frankly, when I was growing up in a small town in Canada, it was difficult to get whatever the latest stuff was. We would have to drive 3 hours to go into a big city, or maybe not even have the opportunity to do that. And the internet has kind of opened up that world in a way that is substantially better. Then we add to the fact that you can get jobs and income from pretty much everywhere. So it used to be you were born in Montenegro or Serbia or somewhere else in Eastern Europe, your opportunities were pretty limited. It was a tough thing. I sometimes have people contact me and they're moving to someplace and they're looking for a job. And I'm like, look, I highly recommend you don't get a job locally. No offense, but the truth is just wages are just much more depressed in that part of the world. You're much better off to work remotely for a company in the US or someplace similar and then live in the place that you want than you are to try and seek local employment in that point. And so going back a long time, this played a really important role in your quality of life. Today, that doesn't have to play any role in your quality of life. Literally, your location of life can be completely separated from your location of living. And this means that you can just live a much better life in some other place. And again, where that place is, there is no one size fits all. I remember living abroad for a number of years and kind of coming to the realization that there is no perfect country. There isn't. There might be a perfect set of countries for some people, and that's great. But you have to choose for you what is best. And what you will find is there are usually opportunities to pursue some sort of residence permits. There are usually some sort of opportunities to pursue, ability to build a life for yourself there if you're willing to look accordingly. And so Saudi Arabia, I think, is a great example of how people's views are probably a bit outdated. This list is probably the case. I think you're going to increasingly see over the next 2 decades that where people are moving and where people are moving from changes quite dramatically. I've had clients contact me who have been, say, Indians, for example, who have been living in Canada for the last, few years. They spent years being able to go through the arduous immigration process, and 4 years later, they're telling me they're in Southeast Asia, and I ask them why. They say, well, cost of living is out of control, economic opportunities are no longer what they used to be, and the healthcare sucks. And a lot of people will tell you in some of these places, oh, I don't want to leave because I'm worried about losing my healthcare. And I'm like, your healthcare sucks. Your healthcare is not that good. The truth is healthcare is better in a lot of these other countries, and frankly, a lot cheaper, etc. So anyway, this just to kind of give a grand tapestry of where things are at today and where things are headed. Now you might ask, where are we kind of bullish on? And I'll end with this, which is, I think you have to pay a lot of attention to trajectory. I play this game with clients. This is where I'll say, tell me what are the places that you believe with a high degree of certainty will be dramatically better 10 years from now than they are today? And the answer is like, people have a hard time coming up with places that they're like, high degree of certainty, dramatically better in 10 years than today. And you can reverse that question. You can say, well, what are the places that are far better today than they were 10 years ago? And again, you start to look, you say, well, is France dramatically better today than it was 10 years ago? I mean, I first went to France in, I guess it was the mid-90s. It was kind of the first time I visited Paris. And, I enjoyed it. We go to France almost every year. I actually quite love France. However, it's not easy for me to argue that France is better today than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or something like that. I can run down a long list of places like that. I lived in Seattle at one point in time. I lived there in 2002. It's not clear to me that Seattle is better today than it was in 2002. In fact, in some respects, I think it's worse. If I consider going to London, I first visited London and I loved London. There's lots of the West End with all the theater district and all these things to do, et cetera. Great, great place. I think there's still a lot of great things about London. But is it better? I don't know. I walked down something like Oxford Street and see all sorts of homelessness, and I'm like, this doesn't really seem better than it was before. It's hard to make that argument. So where do you play that game? And this is one of the things when I first started posting content about UAE years ago, people would criticize me for it. They'd say, oh my gosh, it's terrible. It's built on blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look, I'm paying a lot less attention to where any given place is at and far more to what the trajectory of that place is. And when I look at places like Canada, I think the trajectory is generally downward, at least on a relative basis downward. And I say this because technology tends to bring places up for the most part. But I think broadly, kind of the experience for average people is generally downward. Whereas if I look at places that are generally upward, I think you probably have the Middle East. That's like one of the biggest areas. Is Oman likely to be better 10 years from now than it is today? Probably. Is UAE likely to be better 10 years from now than it is today? Almost certainly. Is Saudi Arabia likely to be better 10 years from now than it is today? Probably. Like, there's not a lot of places in the world that I can make that statement for. And certainly there are some places that are coming off a very low baseline, and so they probably will too, right? There's that. But the problem is their baseline is already really low. And then you've got some other places where you're like, okay, they're doing pretty good. For example, Singapore is a wonderful place. Switzerland is a wonderful place in a bunch of regards. Are they going to be dramatically better in 10 years? Hard to say that they will be. they're great, and they'll probably continue to be relatively good. I don't throw Switzerland into the same pack as I throw a lot of the EU. And I think Singapore is generally a well-run place, and it's probably going to continue to be well-run. They don't have some of the deep structural problems that some other places do. But anyway, I would love to hear from you guys the answer to that question. Where is it that you believe will be dramatically better in 10 years than it is today? And where do you think will be worse in 10 years than it will today? Put them in the comments below, and we will see what different people think. So thank you very much, and I will see you on the next video.